Chair of Islamic Peace at American University's School of International Service. Welcome. I have organized tonight's forum in cooperation with Michael Brenner, the Director of the Center for Israel Studies. Do you want to sort of stand up and say hello? Special thanks goes to the Center's Administrator, Laura Cutler, for helping to organize this evening's event. I believe she is organizing outside of the room at the moment. Our many co-sponsors include the Program on International Conflict and Peace Resolution, including its director, who is with us today, Hratch Gregorian. Where are you? There he is. And especially I thank the administrator of the program, Nicole Smith, for her help tonight. Also sponsoring are the Middle East Studies at American University program, co-directed by myself and Pedram Partovi in the History Department. There he is. And also the Arab World Studies program and the AU Negotiation Project. The inspiration for tonight's forum came as I prepared to teach my course this spring on conflict and peacemaking in Israel and Palestine. I realized as I was putting final touches to my syllabus that we're reaching several pivotal anniversaries this spring. 70 years since the disappearance of a Palestinian state and the establishment of Israel. 50 years since the 1967 war brought all of Jerusalem under Israel's control, but also magnified the dispossession of Palestinians and so altered the relationship between the two peoples under an Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands in the West Bank and Gaza. A third moment, I realized, as I was putting that final touch on the syllabus, that we mark this spring, is the end of a 40-year era, roughly, in which the United States asserted a central role as mediator in the conflict from the mid-1970s and the Camp David I talks. The announcement that the American embassy would move to Jerusalem this spring undoubtedly will alter that role. But how? How exactly will the peace process proceed, if at all, and inevitably in what new fashion, if at all? Even as the violence and suffering continues today, 70 years after the botched UN plan disintegrated into a war in the lands we call Palestine and Israel today, and even as the Israel-Palestine conflict is now surrounded by spreading conflicts of other sorts in the region, at a time of dangerous polarization and war, we stand in danger ourselves of losing sight of the centrality and the importance of continuing to work to resolve this conflict. The donors to my chair, Hani Farsi Father Muhammad, like the IPCR program, and like most of us in the room, are committed to peacemaking. Our students, whom we've given prime seating, you can all wave, are eager as well, I realized, to learn the art of negotiation. So I thought it would be most useful and most appropriate to ask the negotiators themselves to come and join us this evening to share their perceptions of what the American role has been in the past, what it may be in the future, and how the peace process may take new forms in coming years. Let me, at the outset, introduce each of the speakers who have so kindly given their time this evening to join us. I will then hand over the microphone to our moderator today, Professor Anthony Wanis St. John, who has authored a book on the negotiations and who also teaches courses specifically on the art of negotiation. And speaking of books, after the event, we have a table. We're selling books by several of our speakers this evening. Should you be so inspired, we would love to share them with you. So let me present our speakers. First, to the left of Professor Wanis is William B. Quandt, Professor Emeritus of Politics at the University of Virginia, a participant in the National Security, a member of the National Security Council, and participant in the Camp David negotiations from 1977 to 79. Next, Itamar Rabinovich, president of the Israel Institute, professor emeritus and former president of Tel Aviv University, and former ambassador to the United States and chief negotiator with Syria in the early 1990s. in the era of the Oslo Accords. Each of our speakers will open tonight's session with a set of remarks on their own era and moment and over the last 40 years in the peace process. Next, Raif El-Omari, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute on Near East Policy, Advisor to Palestinian negotiators at the Permanent Status Talks, 1999 to 2001. And on the very end, Leila Halal, Senior Fellow at the International Security Program, the New America Foundation, Legal Advisor to Palestinian negotiators, 2002 to 2008. So join me, please, in welcoming our speakers, and I will turn the microphone over to Professor Waniz.
A warm welcome to all the speakers this evening. Thank you for joining us and for sharing the gift of your experience and wisdom with our members of the audience here.
Can't hear you.
Sorry. Is that better? A welcome to our speakers for sharing their experience and wisdom with our students, faculty, and other guests here. The U.S. involvement in the Middle East certainly predates the events of 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel, and goes back some time before that. We do not have time to cover all of the U.S. involvement in the region, but we do have the privilege of having people who have been personally involved in various aspects of the U.S. engagement in the region. And I would simply ask us to think about the first part of our evening together in terms of the strengths, weaknesses, continuities, and dynamics of the U.S. role as it has evolved over the decades, as it goes back more than 70 years. In the second part of our evening, we'll look at the future of U.S. involvement, and I'll ask our panelists if they could share what might be their wisdom for a future American presidency in terms of how it might re-engage in the most constructive manner to help bring about peace in the Middle East. So we will start this evening with 10-minute remarks from each of our speakers, and you are free to shape your comments as you wish, but to share my wish, it's to look at the strengths, weaknesses, continuities, and dynamics of the U.S. role as it has evolved, with particular emphasis on the periods that you are most familiar with. We'll start moving towards my left with Professor Quandt.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to all the organizers of this panel. 10 minutes is not a very long time to tell you in any depth at all why this one particular negotiation that really started in the aftermath of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War and was concluded with the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty in the spring of '79. I'm going to focus on the Camp David negotiations, but I want to try to explain why this was at least a partially successful venture, because all the other cases you're going to hear about ended in failure. Not necessarily because of what the United States did, but none of them worked. The one that did partially succeed was the Egyptian-Israeli track of what had initially been a broader attempt to bring about a more comprehensive Middle East peace settlement. So let me try to make maybe 5 points, which means about 2 minutes each. So first, there was a strategic context in the aftermath of the 1973 war, which negotiation theorists would describe as a hurting stalemate. Neither side had decisively won that war, and neither side was entirely comfortable with the outcome of it. That's the kind of condition in which a mediator might say maybe there's a chance that each side will give something in order to get something in return. That's what negotiations ultimately are all about. If one party is really happy with the status quo, they're not going to give up anything. Or if somebody feels they're so weak and so mistreated that any concession on their part simply weakens them further, they're not going to do very much. So we had a condition in the aftermath of the 73 war, where both the Egyptians and the Israelis seemed possibly interested in moving to a different status quo perhaps, or dynamic of negotiation. And you had an American leadership, mainly Henry Kissinger, but backed by Richard Nixon, who wanted to ensure that this war that had caught them by surprise would not flare up again. We were under an oil embargo and all kinds of things that were unpleasant, and so the United States had an interest, the Israelis had an interest, and the Egyptians had an interest in moving to a new set of conditions. This led to several agreements under Kissinger, partial agreements, and it created the context in which, when President Carter became president, there had been a hiatus in the negotiations caused by our election year, 1976. Nothing much had been done, and Carter was unknown on this. Nobody knew if he was going to take it seriously or not. But I think Carter, like any of the rest of us who were involved in this, did see that there was a strategic rationale for American leadership to build on what Kissinger had done. And then Carter, I think, in his own words, has said that it mattered to him personally because he was a man of religion and the Holy Land meant something to him, and the idea of helping to bring peace to the Holy Land. That's a whole category of analysis that I can't do. You have to get inside somebody else's head. But what I can say is that for all of us who worked with Carter, he was attentive to the strategic imperatives and also had a very strong willingness to engage himself personally in trying to move this forward. So that's one. The conditions need to be right in several different places at the same time to get negotiations going. The other thing that is fair to say is we had a kind of conceptual framework called UN Resolution 242 that didn't answer by any means all of the problems, but it set a kind of boundary. It basically said, if Israel is prepared to relinquish the territory that it captured in 1967, didn't quite say how much of the territory, but it should get in return security, recognition, and peace. Again, not entirely defined, but that was the kind of trade-off that was envisaged. And all of the parties, most of the parties, had more or less said, yes, that's the deal that we're prepared to talk about. So you had the Palestinians, I'm not including in this, but the Arab states and Israel and the United States and the UN had a kind of concept of how this should work. Okay, second point, in addition to having the right conditions, framework, strategic coincidence of events, is talking about the American role in all of this. Peacemaking in the Arab-Israeli arena is not for sissies. You've got to be prepared to spend a lot of time, energy, and political capital. And Carter, perhaps naively, was prepared to do all of that. At one point, his chief of staff wrote him a very, very sensitive, confidential memo saying, do you have any realize what you're doing to your political base by constantly spending all this time on the Middle East and talking about Palestinian rights and things like that? It's very, very politically controversial. And, over time, he came to realize that, but he waded into this without much sense that there's a domestic constraint that I have to worry about. But this is an important consideration. Is the president prepared to put some political capital of his own on the line to get Arab-Israeli peace? And for a lot of presidents, that isn't obviously the case. This time it was. And although I don't want to make this sound too self-serving, there was a team working with Carter, of which I was a part, that by and large saw the issues pretty much the same way. We weren't deeply divided. That often does happen on the American side. You have different factions pushing in different directions, and that can often make things very complicated. This time we had a strong presidential involvement, strong Secretary of State. My boss, Brzezinski, had his problems with the Secretary of State, but not on this issue. And so we worked together pretty well as a team, and I think that mattered at Camp David, where we were 6 or 7 Americans working on the substance, and we'd all worked closely together for a long time. Any president who starts out with an ambitious Middle East policy is bound to discover that you have to make mid-course corrections. We had to do two in the first year. One was the election of Menachem Begin. We didn't know him. We knew his politics, but we didn't know him because we never thought that the Likud party would win. And we were wrong. And so it took us some time to realize that Begin was different. He was different on one issue in particular. He wanted to keep all of what he called Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and it didn't make any difference if it was Jordan or the Palestinians. He was not going to return the West Bank to anybody. And it took us a long time to realize that that probably was his real position, not just a bargaining position. So that forced us to rethink our original calculations. The second moment of reconsideration was when it became clear that Sadat was prepared to move on his own, probably toward a more or less separate peace with Israel. He didn't talk that way to us, he didn't say it explicitly, but when he went to Jerusalem without any prior preparation, caught us by surprise, his willingness to go in November of 1977, that began the process on our part of thinking this track is the one that's going to move much faster than any other part of the Arab-Israeli negotiations. And in order to keep that from happening, we're either going to have to restrain Sadat, which would be odd to try to restrain an Arab leader who wants to make peace, or we're going to have to convince Begin to make concessions toward either Jordan or the Palestinians or to keep other tracks going. Okay, the third decisive moment in the Camp David process came after about a year and a half of normal diplomacy, and very intense, but normal diplomacy. Carter reached the conclusion that only Begin and Sadat could make the key decisions that we thought needed to be made for peace, and that the time had come to bring them together at a summit meeting with Carter himself. And he initially thought that they would come and behave well toward one another and see the historic opportunity. Didn't turn out that way. Direct negotiations between Begin and Sadat were a total failure. But Camp David was not a failure. We kept Begin and Sadat apart for the most of the time after their initial meetings. And then we started putting forward an American compromise proposal based on what we thought each side might be able to accept. And in 10 days, we wrote 26 versions of that. This was before word processors, so it was a lot of typing by a lot of dedicated women, secretaries. And at the end of the day, the decision makers saw that there were just 2 or 3 key decisions that they had to confront. All this verbiage at the end of the day didn't mean nearly as much as it helped to narrow the gap for the final decisions. During the summit itself, there was a mixture of reassurances by the United States to each of the parties and pressure. I don't think you can negotiate only with carrots or only with sticks. You need both. Because we were isolated for 13 days at Camp David, there were no cell phones, nobody was talking to the press, nobody in the outside world much knew what was going on. So Carter had a moment when he could use whatever instruments he had, and he used them particularly with Sadat, when Sadat threatened to leave. He was very tough with him and said, you can't leave because that will end our relationship entirely. And Sadat at that point said, in that case, I have no choice. And that's a reminder that this was not just a negotiation between Egypt and Israel, it was also each party negotiating with the United States for side payments, for reassurances, for guarantees, whatever. Finally, we made a few mistakes at Camp David. We were careless about a couple of things. One of them had to do with settlement activity in the West Bank. I don't have time to explain that. But by and large, we were pretty careful about getting the details right on the Egyptian-Israeli part of the deal, and that agreement has lasted. It's been 40 years, and both sides more or less are comfortable with living up to the terms of that agreement. The last point I will make is that once you have an agreed framework, you think you're pretty close to getting, peace. It took us 6 more months after Camp David, and there were moments when it looked like it was falling apart, and it probably could have. Carter was urged by his political advisors to give up on it. that it was getting too costly. He needed to concentrate on re-election politics. He didn't decide to do that. Instead, he went to the Middle East in the spring of 1979 as a kind of make-or-break effort to get the deal. It was an extraordinary trip. Sadat almost immediately said, just get the best deal you can, but this is the thing I most need. We arrived in Israel and found that Begin didn't want to make a deal. And I was convinced at that point that we had failed. 3 days later, we came back with an agreement. But it shows that until you get right to the finish line, you never know that you're there. And you never know what else you might have got. My own evaluation is that in the circumstances, we probably did as well as we could have. We made one crucial mistake on at Camp David and not pinning something down that probably could have been pinned down. But by and large, even though I had hoped for a more comprehensive peace as the result of our efforts, I'm pretty sure that we got the best deal that we could at that particular time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Quandt. Itamar Rabanovich.
Thank you. Can you hear me? It's okay? Okay. I will,
Bring it closer.
okay. I will focus mostly on the 4 years during which I was a participant as chief negotiator with Syria and ambassador to Washington. As chief negotiator with Syria, obviously I was trying to make peace with Syria. As ambassador to Washington, I dealt in close cooperation with the Clinton administration, with the other tracks of the peace process, primarily the Palestinian process, the Oslo Accord. So I'm familiar with both. Let me begin. Our moderator asked about continuity. There was continuity from Camp David in a number of ways. Number one, when we talk about the Oslo Accord, it was an interim agreement for 5 years, basically an autonomy plan for the Palestinians as a transitional arrangement. It was to a large extent predicated on the autonomy plan that was part of Camp David. So that is one way in which Camp David affected the peace process of the 90s. Second, when Rabin decided that he wanted to make peace with Syria, the peace agreement that he had in mind was predicated on the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement that was agreed at Camp David. And thirdly, Rabin was inspired by Menachem Begin. As I say, we had all kinds of Israeli prime ministers. Some of them wanted to make peace and to move, and some of them did not. Begin, Sharon, Begin were three leaders who were not just ready to make peace or willing to make peace, but they were able to go against their grain. Menachem Begin, the hawk, made peace with Egypt. Sharon, the leader of the Israeli extreme right wing and father of the settlements, is the one who took Israel out of Gaza and destroyed the settlements in Gaza and would have continued in the West Bank in some way. And Yitzhak Rabin, who for years was opposed to withdrawal from the Golan and did not want to talk to the PLO, was the architect and the leader of the Israeli peace process of the mid-1990s that did precisely that. So, now the American role. So the Prime Minister recruited me to work in diplomacy and with whom I worked closely was Yitzhak Rabin, who was a great believer in close relationship with and coordination with the United States. He was a great believer in the importance of that relationship and in the unique position of the United States as the only power that could orchestrate or look over, facilitate Arab-Israeli peace processes. So it was a period of unusually close cooperation between the United States and Israel. Tensions like the one between Carter and Begin that Bill Quandt referred to before were absent from the scene. There were points of disagreement. There were moments of tension, but they were rare and without, I would say, the venom of some of the Carter-Begin relationship. So the peace process itself, first called the Madrid process, it began with a peace conference in Madrid, organized by the Bush-Baker administration after the first Gulf War. And this gives us some of the strategic setting for the process. The United States was at the height of its influence and prestige in the Middle East, having saved Kuwait and Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein, having led a coalition, international coalition that included Arab participants. And also, Bush and Baker came out of the war with the conviction that it was time to end the Arab-Israeli conflict because Iraq had just used WMD against Israel, the Scud missiles, and they realized that it could get out of hand, and they were determined to capitalize on the Washington's unique position in the world, and also it now was the world's only superpower, and in the region in order to try to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. Very ambitious. The Madrid conference put together a whole framework. Yitzhak Rabin was elected prime minister in 1992, replaced a right-wing government. The previous prime minister was not particularly keen on the Madrid conference. Rabin was keen on the idea, not necessarily on the format. Now, his strategy was there were 4 participants with Israel in the peace process. 2 could not be the first to make a deal, Lebanon or Jordan. Lebanon was a Syrian colony, and Jordan was a monarchy, not enjoying the legitimacy sufficient for being the first, so it could be either Syria or the Palestinians. Rabin's preference, and that of the Clinton administration, was Syria, a Syria-first policy. Because Syria, the Israeli-Syrian conflict was simpler than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, basically a territorial conflict over the Golan Heights, once Syria agreed in principle to join a peace process. Syria, it sounds a bit ironic nowadays, was a powerful state, coherent state, with an authoritative leader, difficult to negotiate with, but credible in delivery. And the Palestinians, of course, were not a state, were a community led by a much more complex leader, Yasser Arafat. So both the Clinton administration and Rabin believed that if you achieve a breakthrough with Syria, and this becomes the basis of the peace process, other agreements, including with the Palestinians, would follow suit with relative ease. There was a problem, though, that neither we nor the United States could solve. Assad was a very difficult man, strong-minded, and he said, I'm willing to make peace with Israel, but I will not elaborate on the nature of that peace before Israel commits to full withdrawal from the Golan Heights, which is my territory. And our position, and the US position too, was you don't begin a negotiation with the bottom line. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you mean? No, he would not. And that remained the issue until the summer of 1993. By that time, while the formal talks in Washington were not going anywhere, as track 2 negotiation took place in Oslo. The United States knew about it, was not a full partner to it, and that second track effected the breakthrough known as the Oslo Accords. Rabin gave his blessing to the negotiations in Oslo, and he gave his blessing to the outcome, but he was not entirely pleased with it. He was ambivalent about Oslo. And that takes us to a very dramatic moment that brings in, I think, most of the elements we have in mind. In early August 1993, Secretary of State Warren Christopher comes to Jerusalem. He is to go to Damascus on the next day. Rabin knows that Oslo is a done deal. Christopher also knows about Oslo. I'll explain in a minute. And Rabin then drops a bombshell in a small meeting, 4 persons, Rabin, Christopher, Dennis Ross, and myself, and says to Secretary of State, tomorrow, when you go to Damascus, ask Assad, if he gets what he wants, will he give me what I want? Which is known as the hypothetical question technique, a well-known technique in negotiations to break a deadlock. And then he went on to elaborate on what he had in mind, and this is, as I indicated before, was pretty much predicated on the Egyptian example, with one difference, that Sadat decided to reverse the normal procedure, and he went to Jerusalem before the deal in order to educate the Israeli public that Egypt was no longer an enemy and to make Begin's task much easier in returning to Sinai. Assad would have none of that. He said, it's not my job to help Rabin deliver the Israeli public. I will deliver Syria. He needs to deliver Israel, and that was that. But Rabin said that in order for him to be able to sell the deal in Israel, he wants a lot of normalization up front and evacuation of settlements only later on. And then he said to Secretary Christopher, and this is very important, he said, number one, this is secret, of course. If it comes out, it's gone. Second, and he repeated that 5 times, remember, it's in your pocket, it must not be on the table. And so Rabin's expectation was that what Christopher would do would be what Bill's former boss Kissinger would do, or what Jim Baker would do, go to Damascus and tell Assad, you know, I was in Jerusalem yesterday, I spoke to Rabin, I can see the beginning of a movement, why don't you give me something? And you spent 2 or 3 weeks, Kissinger spent a whole month in 1974 negotiating just a disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria. Well, unfortunately, the American team just put Rabin's deposit on the table, and of course, Assad predictably said, in principle it's okay, but, and then he began to whittle down the Israeli proposal. Christopher comes back to Jerusalem and tells Rabin what went on. Rabin's chin dropped. He understood what happened. And then on top of that, he asked the Secretary of State, so how long are you staying in the region? And the answer was, no, we are going back home. It's August. It's vacation time. So that didn't take us very long. There was no deal with Syria. And Rabin's decision was we go to Oslo. And this is how Oslo was signed as a second option. Just one final word, because it's quite common to think that the United States was fully surprised by Oslo. It was not. There was a channel of briefing the United States, both by the Norwegians and by the Israelis. And as Rabin completed his presentation to Secretary Christopher, Christopher asked, in that case, what do you do with the Gaza-Jericho plan? And Rabin's answer was, in that case, there will be just Gaza, there will be no Jericho. So obviously, he knew what he was talking about. So that was the highlight, of course, of the peace process, generated a lot of hope, and there was hope in the air that the Oslo Accord was the beginning of the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But as we found out, and as will be elaborated by my 2 successors, this is not the way things developed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Oslo peace process culminated in an agreement called the Declaration of Principles, which set out a period of negotiation that was to result in 2 further accords, the interim agreement, and then hopefully eventually a permanent status agreement. And Gaith Al-Amri will discuss with us, share with us some of his experience in the permanent status talks that were to take place during that 5-year interim period.
Thank you very much. I will echo Bill to say I'm supposed to condense one of the most controversial periods in Palestinian-Israeli peacemaking in 10 minutes. So excuse me if I'm going to be telegraphic. I'm going to approach, of course, I'm going to talk about the American role, but I will talk about it from a point of view of a Palestinian negotiator. I'm not going to be an objective academic observer. I'm going to look at how we saw it as Palestinian negotiators and how it played out. I'll be describing a failed process, and therefore, by necessity, I will be very critical. I'll show where the Americans failed. So let me maybe put perspective before I say that, and say that there is no one but the United States that can lead the peace process. With all of the mistakes, with everything, the US has to lead, and this is something that the Palestinians understood. And did not understand it with a kind of naive, dreamy way. We understood also the baggage that will come with it. We understood the depth of the Israel-US relationship. We were very frustrated by it at certain points, but at no point did we think of looking for another sponsor because we understood there could be no other sponsor. You asked about continuity. In this case, actually, and I'm going to talk about the period from 1999, late 99 to really 2001, early 2001. In this case, there was no continuity because between the signing of Oslo and when we started negotiations in 99, there was a pause. Netanyahu was prime minister. He had no interest in doing this. We had to wait until the election of Barak. Barak was elected, and the US immediately got very involved in relaunching the process. So in September, Secretary Albright goes to Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. An agreement is signed to relaunch the negotiations, and then the Americans basically disappear. We launched the negotiations in November between Ramallah and Jerusalem. The Americans sometimes are there, sometimes are not there. Here, there was a bit of continuity. Here, the focus of the Americans and the Israelis, like in the time of Itamar, was on the Syrian track. So from November, the launch, until the spring, when that track collapsed in Geneva, basically, we were wasting time. As we were wasting time, however, the US, of course, had a role as a convener, but not as an active participant. We will come here to the Bolling Air Force Base. Sometimes the American negotiators will meet us for the first day, and then basically we're left on our own. There was clarity that the focus at that point, the political focus, was on Syria. Now, what happened while the Americans and the Israelis were testing the Syrian track, the momentum on the Palestinian side was dying. Arafat has basically lined up his political system to deal with the negotiations in a serious way, starting in November 1999. That started eroding. So when the Syrian track collapsed and we moved to the next phase, the Palestinians had already entered it with our political makeup already showing cracks. Now, when the Americans started paying attention to the Palestinian track, in a sense, there was not much for the Americans to do. Because at that point, while the official track that was happening in Washington was going nowhere, there was a backtrack that was already started in Stockholm between Palestinians and Israelis, and that was making decent progress. So in that sense, there was no need for a substantive American role. The Americans were apprised, the Americans knew what was happening, the Americans continued to be involved, but there was no necessity for an American substantive role in the process. This all changed when the Stockholm track also collapsed. And that collapsed because of some political tensions within the Palestinian team. Some people who felt were excluded, felt that the process was going without them, made that secret track public, and suddenly we had no backtrack, and we had to go back to the front, to the open track. And that's when the Americans came in. The American assessment at that point that the Stockholm track had created enough substantive progress that it was time to start with a summit, to call for a summit, to call for basically to bring it all together, and it was ripe for a decision. Arafat was very uncomfortable with this. He was very uncomfortable with this for two reasons, three reasons. One, he felt, and I think rightly, that the issues were not ripe yet. Yes, Stockholm made progress, but there were so many issues that were still to be finalized, to be discussed, to be matured. We made breakthroughs, but we did not build on these breakthroughs during that period. So that's one. Two, Arafat was really afraid that he was going to be blamed. Arafat felt that the timing of calling for a summit was dictated by the American and Israeli political calendar. Barak was facing political problems of his own. Clinton was coming towards the end of his term. And so we felt at that time that we were being brought to an unripe process and basically to be offered with an ultimatum. And Arafat insisted on basically asking that if we go, do not blame us. Never got a clear commitment to that, and that, of course, came to haunt us later on. Camp David gets announced. Palestinians are reluctant. This was a case where the Americans actually played a very skillful diplomatic process. They mobilized the Europeans, mobilized the Arabs, particularly Mubarak at that time, who had a lot of sway on Arafat, and we go to Camp David. And this is where the next stage of that phase comes in. We come into Camp David. Now, books have been written about Camp David. Every side made plenty of mistakes. We did, the Israelis did. Our topic here is the Americans, so I will talk about the American role. First of all, Camp David was very rushed. And we saw that really on maybe day 2 or 3, I can't remember, of Camp David. There we were, and the Americans present an American plan. That was, to my mind, basically the moment where the Camp David summit died for 2 reasons. The plan itself was, how shall I say it, not terribly nuanced, not terribly sophisticated, to such a point that both the Palestinians and Israelis immediately rejected it. Arafat did a typical Arafat, ordered us all to pack our bags, called for the cars to come and take us from Camp David. Barak was not very happy with that. Already, we were uncomfortable. We were feeling that the Americans were not doing their homework. But what's even worse than that, once the Americans were confronted with the Israeli and Palestinian rejection, they pulled the paper off the table. Now that sent a very bad message to both sides. And the message was, pout, get angry, throw a hissy fit, and the Americans will relent. And from that moment on, it actually became difficult for the American to approach us with any degree of credibility. But also, there was a sign of American desperation in that summit, in that I mentioned earlier, we were at a point where the Palestinian political system, or at least at the top, was very fractured. The old guard felt that the young guard were eager for a deal and in order to basically dethrone them, a lot of power politics, and the Americans played into this dynamic. The Americans, facing great, Arafat remained a bit aloof. The old guard were basically very hardline, very unresponsive. Some of the young guard were much more responsive. So the Americans, rather than trying to kind of deal with this dynamic, decided to go with some of the young guard, which ended up even hardening further the position of the old guard. Arafat, who thought he could play these two dynamics, ended up being caught in them because Arafat was a leader who needed a degree of consensus in his own group in order to make decisions. The other aspect in Camp David, where I felt was underdeveloped, is while the Americans used the Arabs very effectively, particularly the Egyptians, to bring the Palestinians to the negotiating table. To the negotiating table, at the end of the day, in Camp David itself, they were not participants. And when things got bad, when things got bad, that's when the Americans thought of reaching out to the Arabs, reach out to Mubarak, to others. At that point, it was too late, including the Arabs who felt that they were cheated out of the process, were not willing to come and participate. Camp David fails, Arafat gets blamed, there is turmoil, but the negotiations actually did not end. Once we went back, recovered from Camp David, we engaged in negotiations and the Americans re-engaged. Which brings me to the last phase of this period. At that point, the Americans started developing a new paper, what eventually became the Clinton parameters. Now that was very interesting. By September, something was mature. The Americans invite us late September, us and the Israelis, show us some ideas. September 27th, we meet with the Americans and they say, we have these ideas, we want to present to the president next week. Go back home and tell your leaders that this is going to happen. We get on our airplanes, land in Tel Aviv airport, the Intifada has broken. They present the plan to the president says, too early, let's wait for the violence to subside. We wait 3 months, actually more than that, 3 months. We wait 3 months and the idea and the Clinton parameters are presented December 25th, too late, too much violence, Clinton is leaving, and the decision on the Palestinian side at that point was, let's wait, let's not give this gift to this departing president, let's give it to the incoming president, one of the worst decisions that we have made. 2 concluding remarks. 2 points, there are many takeaways from that period. To me, there are 2 takeaways that I would like to focus on right now, briefly. One thing that struck me in the American team throughout is how little the American team understood Palestinian politics. And this continues to be the case until now. This was true of Bush, Obama, and obviously the current team. And I'm not saying that the Americans should actually subsume the American policy to Palestinian politics. The US is a superpower. At the end of the day, we shouldn't. And one of the mistakes, and I think one of the criticisms, that the US often subsumes its policy to Israeli politics. But if you don't understand the macro and the micro in the Palestinian side, you will not know when the time is ripe to present a deal or when the time is not ripe to present a deal. And if you don't understand the micro, you will not understand why a certain actor is saying a certain thing. Is it because they have a principled position or because they're playing a political game domestically? The second, which I alluded to, is while the US, as I mentioned in the beginning, has to lead, should lead, no one else can do it, leadership does not mean monopolization. And throughout that period, the US was monopolizing. Sometimes would bring others for very functional reasons, like they brought the Egyptians to convince Arafat to go to Camp David, but there was no degree of continuity or systemization in that sense. So when the US does that, there are value added that can be brought by other actors, by other players, and we did not benefit from that. And with this note, I think I will conclude, and maybe we'll look in the future in the next section.
Thank you very much. Leila Helal.
Sure. Is this on? Hello? So my moment was when the Intifada had, second Intifada had been going on for a few years, and Sharon was Prime Minister of Israel, and this moment was what Sharon defined as unilateralism. And so I started as, I guess one thing I need to make clear, I'm not a negotiator. I was a technical advisor to the negotiations. And I started in 2002 at the time when Sharon's unilateral movement was sort of coming to a head with a military invasion of Palestinian areas that had been previously areas that the Palestinians had gained territorially under the Oslo Agreement. So Sharon was reversing those gains, however minimal, and reoccupying areas of the West Bank that what was under Palestinian control, and pursuing this unilateral movement, which involved ultimately the withdrawal of Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip in 2005. And at that period, there were negotiations. I was not directly a part of them, but I was a close witness to those negotiations. And you did see a very active US role in trying to get the Israelis to negotiate with the Palestinians on the terms of the withdrawal, and to leverage this interest on the part of the Israelis to withdraw from Gaza, to leverage it in order to make some gains that could possibly create a more peaceful situation in the area and for the conflict. And so Condoleezza Rice, Foreign Secretary, was very engaged in trying to get the Israelis to talk to the Palestinians, and the area where the Israelis would talk to the Palestinians was on the issue of movement and access. And so the Americans were brokering a deal which eventually ended up being the agreement of movement and access. And what did that agreement provide? It provided essentially to open the border of the southern border of the Gaza Strip, the Rafah crossing point, and to create an arrangement for EU monitors. And this was a significant event. But the deal, and there were other elements to it, which I'm happy to talk about if anyone is interested, but it was ultimately, it wasn't implemented. It was negotiated at the end of 2005. January 2006, the Palestinians had elections. Hamas won parliamentary control, and then there was the routing of the Palestinians from Gaza Strip, and there was now a pretense, Hamas control of Gaza, not to implement the movement and access agreement. So another lost opportunity, if you will. That was one of my moments in the negotiations. The other was in 2009, for what was paraphrased as the Oslo talks. And these talks were interesting because they were led on on the Palestinian side by Saab Erekat, and on the Israeli side by Tiffany Livni. And both of these individuals are people that wanted a deal. The U.S. was present, the U.S. was involved in bringing the parties together under Bush, but they were not, but the U.S. was not an active participant like it was in the Camp David period under Clinton, who I think had a lot of ambition to be the peacemaker. I don't think Bush shared that ambition. And so while the U.S. was helping to convene the Annapolis talks, they were ultimately driven by two people, an Israeli and a Palestinian, who really wanted peace, but in the end were not able to make it happen. Why? Because I think that there is a falsehood that the Palestinians and Israelis can make peace. The conflict is not ripe for solution. And it's also, the role of the U.S. has been to try to pronounce and push formulas, political formulas, that can be accepted to Israeli and Palestinian elites. And the fact is that these formulas are not accepted by the people. The people are not ready to make peace and to make the compromises that are required in order to make peace between people who are really living in the same territorial area. So unlike the peacemaking between Israel and Syria or Israel and Egypt, the Palestinian conflict is very specific. It's about two people that need to figure out how to coexist. And so the ability of the U.S. to actually be a broker for peace is a bit limited, because ultimately the issue, because as we've seen them do, I mean, in the Clinton period, very successfully come up with these formulas that look like they could work, that give the Palestinians a state on the 1967 borders, that relinquish the right of return, which is in the Israeli Jewish interest, that they are not going to have 5 million Palestinians come and destroy the Jewish state. So these things that you think that are that will deliver the people and the conflict to a peaceful arrangement, Saab Erekat and Tiffany Livni could agree on that, but they can't deliver it, they can't implement it, because the people are not ready for peace. And so I think the question that we should be asking is not what is the role of the U.S. in making peace in terms of brokering between elites behind closed doors, but it's in really trying to help frame the conflict in a way that pushes the leaders of these respective populations to understand that if you're going to make peace, you have to make peace between people, and therefore the population and what they want and what they're willing to accept matters. And the U.S., the way it's brokered peace between Israel and Palestine has been to force the people out of the equation. And so it has not been a useful role, and we are at a really bad time in the history of the conflict, because you have Palestinians who live behind walls, you have the Israelis who think that they don't need to make peace with the Palestinians in order to exist, and you now have a U.S. That is irrelevant to if at best. And so I think that we need to be asking really deep questions about conflict resolution in the region, and the role of the U.S., I think, is a surface level question.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite the panelists to discuss amongst themselves some of the points that they brought up and heard from each other. It is very interesting that our last comment was about the lack of depth of the U.S. role in terms of engaging the communities and the civil society among Palestinians and Israelis, and moves us away from a focus on state-centric diplomacy. Colleagues?
This is quite interesting because, I mean, first of all, of course, the US cannot engage other people's politics. Every time we try to engage other people's politics, we fail miserably. There's plenty of examples. Yet, there's an interesting point here. If you look at Israeli-Egyptian peace, if you look at Israeli-Jordanian peace, I challenge anyone in this room to find more than a handful of Egyptians who actually like Israel, to find more than a handful of Jordanians who actually believe that Israel even has a right to exist. Yet you have peace agreements that succeeded. And why was that? It's not because the people believed in the other side, because the people believed in their leaders. So one of the questions that we actually have to ask, as we look at least on the Palestinian side, do you have a Palestinian leadership that have the legitimacy to make these kind of difficult compromises? Changing public perception will take a long time. So the focus right now, I believe, should be on building and rebuilding the legitimacy of the Palestinian system. That's something the US can help with. It cannot do it for the Palestinians, but it can help with in terms of pushing for reform, good governance. We saw it done quite successfully under George Bush. So I believe in that sense, yes, we cannot engage in the process until it's ripe, but we can help make the situation more ripe.
I invite the other panelists to join in.
Yeah, I share Raif's perspective. I think leadership matters the most, and people will follow, and therefore the United States needs to work with leaders, and leaders needs to work with leaders. Jordanian-Israeli peace would not have been achieved but for the personal relationship between King Hussein and Prime Minister Rabin. I spoke before about Sadat's unique approach. You know, Sadat before he went to Jerusalem, went to see President Assad of Syria and offered him to join him. And Assad said, "You're crazy. First of all, you're a traitor. You go to Jerusalem. And number two, you're an idiot because you begin at the end with going to Jerusalem and speaking in the Israeli parliament before you see an inch of your land." And Sadat said, "You don't understand." He said, "I persuade the Israeli public that Egypt is no longer an enemy and they will allow Begin to give me back the Sinai. I will get the Sinai. You will never see the Golan Heights." And in a way, he was right. Now, in the Israeli-Palestinian context, you have to look again at leaders. Sharon, who for years was considered an arch-enemy, the leader of the extreme right wing, so forth, he reached a point in his mid-70s when he began to think about history. He didn't have to think about the next election. He had to think about his responsibility, about his place in history, and he was ready to make the big decisions. Ehud Barak comes to power. He wants to resolve both the Palestinian and the Syrian conflict, but he lacks the political gifts that peacemaking would take. Ehud Olmert was very bold in what he proposed to Mahmoud Abbas, but it happened in the last few weeks of his term, and you know, who wants to make a deal with somebody who is on his way out? So there's a history of a lot of near misses in that regard, and of course we have to mention other elements that are part of the picture: extremism, terror on both sides, the killing of Rabin, the massacre at the tomb of the patriarch on the Israeli side, and of course the terrorist attacks by Hamas and other groups on the Palestinian side that meant and succeeded to destroy the Israeli public's support of peace. So you need a comprehensive strategy to take all these elements into account, but unlike Mizilal, I think it's a top-down and not a bottom-up approach.
Bill, do you care to chime in?
I think it's inevitable that the formal diplomacy concentrates on leaders dealing with other leaders. I do think there are ways in which you can sometimes make it easier for a leader to build the popular support that they need. There was a moment when Sadat was really quite frustrated with what he saw as a kind of tentative commitment on the American side. And he said, you know, I went to Jerusalem, I've done all this, and you still seem to be hesitating. And he said, I want the United States to be a full partner, and I want my people to know that. So he said, can't you find some way of using that phrase, of saying the United States will be a full partner, we're in this with you? And it was controversial because some people said, well, you know, that's going to look like we're one-sided. So are we also a full partner with the Israelis? Does it really mean anything? But at the end of the day, we did use the term publicly, and Sadat was grateful for it. And did it really help him with his own people? Well, he eventually was, of course, killed, and most people in Egypt are kind of ambivalent about his legacy today, although probably a little bit better than it used to be. It always takes somebody in between who does a really terrible job to make you think that maybe it wasn't so bad in the old days. I want to just shift for a moment to something that Itamar said, and he said it in his books, and he said it this evening, and it puzzles me because it is true that Clinton and Rabin wanted to do the Syrian track first, and there were good reasons for that. And although everybody knew that Assad was a tough negotiator, and that he would, if he did negotiate, it was going to be painstaking, there was still a logic to it, and it would have made, had it succeeded, it would have made the Palestinian track, I think, more tractable. So, the story that we heard this evening, which I'm sure is accurate, from Itamar about Christopher coming and not fully understanding what Rabin's hypothetical pocket offer was, leads Christopher to go and misplay the card he's been given. And I think that's probably true as far as it goes. What surprises me is that having invested so heavily in the Syrian first track, that Rabin wasn't prepared to try harder to keep it alive. Because what Christopher came back with was not a rejection of this, it was a quibble. Yeah, my understanding, it was a quibble. Is what does he mean by willingness to withdraw from the Golan Heights? Does it mean all of the Golan Heights to the 67 lines or not? That's always what Assad asked. There was no surprise that he would ask that. And yet, from my understanding, including reading Itamar's book, Rabin sees that as a lack of seriousness after he has made this kind of gesture of hypothetically allowing Christopher to explore that if this, then this, and so forth, and very quickly seems to abandon the Syrian track. And I'm puzzled by that. Yes, I know Christopher wanted to go on vacation and all the rest, but if you really are committed strategically to the Syrian track, you say, fine, go have your 1 week vacation, think about it, and let me tell you, when you come back a week from now after your vacation in California, I want you to go back to Syria and explain more effectively what I have in mind, that I'm prepared to make concessions, but only when I get something in return, or when we move in tandem. And that didn't happen. I can't understand for the life of me why it didn't.
So let me try to explain. Number one, Rabin saw it, I'd say, more gravely than would sound from your explanation, in the sense that he felt that his part of the bargain had been given away. I mean, Sadat now had, hypothetical or not, Assad, I'm sorry, Assad now had, hypothetical or not, the withdrawal in his pocket. Rabin's package was being whittled down by Assad, and through a negotiator that Rabin lost faith in. So that made it a bit more difficult. But there was another, maybe more overwhelming consideration. That was a domestic Israeli issue, the Rabin-Peres relationship. Because the father of Oslo, the architect of Oslo at that phase, was Shimon Peres, who was Rabin's partner in the government, but also rival. It's you know, in this country, we are watching presidents firing cabinet ministers every Monday and Thursday. In Israel, it's more difficult, particularly when you your foreign minister controls about a third of the vote in the party center. And Peres was going to fight for Oslo. And Rabin could only, if let's say, if Christopher had come back from Damascus with a positive response, Rabin could have told Peres and could have told the party, if Peres chose to go and confront him in the party, I have a deal with Syria, and therefore I'm not going to Oslo. But he did not have a deal with Syria. So waiting for Christopher to come and to clarify and so forth would not have worked in real political terms in the Israeli context. So that domestic personal consideration was a massive dimension of Rabin's decision to opt for Oslo after all.
That's a good connection to the domestic international sort of nexus in negotiations. I'd like to tie that back into the elite sort of civil society issue. It's true that states diplomats don't engage necessarily with the communities of our bilateral relationship countries. On the other hand, we do have public diplomacy. Leaders, however, do engage with their populations. Now, in a place like the Middle East, leaders have demonized the enemy states and their people and leaders for decades. The opposite, engaging one's population to accept an eventual peace deal, is something that I believe has been seriously neglected by leaders in the region. And the most memorable time where one leader did it was Sadat's visit to Jerusalem. The second time was Rabin's appearance at the peace rally where he was assassinated. So it often seems that these demonstrations come very late and have some awful repercussions, possibly because we neglect that task. So I'd invite the panel to perhaps comment on this connection back to the communities and what we do, what leaders do to prepare people for the eventuality of possibly uncomfortable compromises that mean living with your enemy and making your enemy no longer the enemy.
So I just want to say that I think the U.S. has a role to play in terms of what we've seen in the Middle East is making guarantees. So the Israeli-Egyptian peace deal has been viable because of why? Because what happened when they made the deal? The U.S. began giving Egypt $1.5 billion of aid annually. So, of course, the U.S. does have a role to play. Outside parties do have a role to play in making things like guarantees that can compel peace, leaders to make peace, that can convince publics that it's worthwhile, that can create an architecture of support for a deal. But that comes at a high cost, because now you have a situation in Egypt where you have a regime that is not accountable to its people because it's getting external support. And I don't think that these deals between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Egypt, is because the people believed in their leaders. It's because we don't have democratic countries where people could express an opposite opinion, and because these kinds of guarantees come in that change the dynamic. And I want to say that I'm not against diplomacy, but what I do think is that in the Middle East there is a perception that deals can be made without first creating constituency for peace. Now, Livni could not take back a deal that was based on the compromise of the Palestinians giving up the right of return for the 67 borders with land swaps, because there's no constituency for the two-state solution in Israel. It hasn't been nurtured. It hasn't been promoted. Instead of promoting that constituency, instead we promoted elite back deal, top-down peacemaking. And I think that we've done that at a cost, because you can't even sell the two-state solution anymore to the Israeli people. So, and I don't, and let me also say, Abbas can say to Omar, I'll give up the right of return, no refugees are going to come back to Israel. But he can't deliver that. And Livni knows that, and the Israeli people know that. And so you have to build constituencies for peace, and no diplomacy, no top-down process can escape that.
Well, we're not in such disagreement, because when you say you have to build constituency for peace, what I'm saying is that the leadership has to build. I mean top-down in that regard, but the leaders need to invest to educate the people, and also to, at the same, remember, this is a world in which every word, even one said in a closed room somewhere in South Africa, resonates in the social networks and in the media. When Arafat spoke in Durban in South Africa and used the term jihad, I had to defend it here. It was not easy, so I had to explain, which in the dictionary you can find, that jihad can also mean spiritual exertion. But so you are talking to your own people, at the same time everything you say is heard and listened to on the other side. That becomes a fairly complex exercise. Let me make 2 points. One is another great act by a Middle Eastern leader, you mentioned too, was done by King Hussein. There was an incident in which a Jordanian soldier killed 7 Israeli schoolgirls. Went berserk and killed. King Hussein flew to the town where the family of the girls lived and came to apologize to the families, and he knelt before the families. So here you have an Arab king kneeling before grieving Jewish families. That did not take away one iota from King Hussein's dignity, and did miles of goodwill in the Israeli public. Yeah. The second example is Syria, the people I had to deal with. Assad simply did not believe in public diplomacy. That word did not resonate with him, while Sadat instinctively understood television and mass communication and the relationship between media and politics in a democracy. Assad was tone deaf to all of this. So we invested months in trying to persuade Assad to send his foreign minister, Farouk Eshara, to give an interview to Israeli state television. Yeah. There's a major program on a Friday night. In those days, there were not that many channels. 80% of the country tune into that newscast. Farouk Eshara gives the first interview to Israeli television. Of course, he's sour-faced, and he begins by saying, the original sin of Israel's creation. Did not resonate too well in Israel. Yeah.
I mean, just 3 quick points. First of all, I'm actually not sure I agree with the premise. You know, the major breakthroughs that we've seen in the Middle East were ones where the final deal, the final package was sprung on the public. I was involved in many track tours that we tried to kind of educate the public for peace and whatever. And every time I would talk to an audience in a refugee camp or in a village or something like this, they will come to me and say, this is all very nice, but why are you exposing your cards before we get the real deal? Every time we've seen a real concrete agreement that promised people a credible change in their lives. In the future, we've seen the people adopt it, even when the elites did not adopt it. You look at Oslo, not very popular among the elites, very popular at the time of its signing with the public. So sometimes you might not want to prepare your public. Sometimes creating a new reality is what you need to move your public. So that's kind of just a question that I will leave hanging out there. The second question, and I will point when I repeat that, is the question of legitimacy. I was living in Jordan when King Hussein did this. I can tell you, it's not very popular to see your king go and kneel in front of people that you don't like. Yet, all of us who grew up in Jordan had such faith in King Hussein, even though he was not elected, etc. Legitimacy is created differently in different societies, and that allowed him to do that. So that's the kind of margin that you need to be legitimate. The third point, which is where the US can actually help. You know, part of the problem with the Palestinian-Israeli side of things is that we're not only dealing with concrete issues. We're dealing with a lot of issues that are narrative. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, how many hours I spent with Israelis arguing who loves Jerusalem more, Jews or Muslims. You know, was 1948 a good year or a bad year? And as you define, you know, one thing as a shepherd, as someone who runs the process, which is the United States, you can define what is to be negotiated, what is to be left for another process. And I think for Palestinians and Israelis, negotiations have become a religion. Give us anything, we will negotiate it. Some things cannot be negotiated. There are other conflict resolution tools besides negotiations. And I think for the person who's going to design the next negotiation process, it might be worth saying, you know what, take 1948 and let's put it in a process of not negotiation and compromise, but a process of mutual sensitization, the issue of attachment, things of this sort. So we can actually widen, as the US, as the one who is designing the process, we can widen the tools available to the parties.
I wonder if I could fast forward us to an eventual U.S. election year in the near future, in which there is a new transition team that has been identified, Republican or Democratic, it doesn't matter. And that transition team approaches each one of my fellow panelists here and asks you to formulate some brief advice to the incoming administration on how to re-engage with the Middle East, with the Palestinian-Israeli peace process in particular. If you could distill some thoughts, maybe 2 or 3, and then we will open up the discussion to the audience.
Honestly, I don't know what I would say, especially 2 or 3 more years like the current situation. I think you have to be very, very starry-eyed optimist to believe that, you know, this will pass and we will be able to get back on something we recognize as a negotiation that could produce a compromise between Israelis and Palestinians that would fit a 2-state model. I think there was a chance for that. I think it was in the mid-1990s. In all honesty, I think having missed it then, missed it in the 1990s, there's never been a good chance since. So I mean, one thing is do no harm if you can find a way to do that. And I think that, frankly, as much as I have spent most of my academic and professional career on the Israeli-Palestinian part of the Middle East, I would say it's not the most important strategic challenge now to the United States. I would say we are going to be, if we avoid a major war with Iran in the next few years, that relationship between the United States and Iran is going to be extremely important. How we handle this amazing, you know, perception that Saudi Arabia is the key to everything in the Middle East, I can tell you, in the past, people who dealt with the Saudis did not feel that way about the Saudis and their role in the Middle East. You tried to buffer them from getting too deeply involved because they weren't up to playing the game with very much skill or sophistication, nor did they want to be very visible. All of a sudden, that's changing. Are we on the right track there? I would say that's important. Obviously, handling the kind of breakdown and perhaps reconstitution of the Syrian state is a huge geostrategic challenge. Not that it's ours to fix, but we have to figure out how to work with a lot of neighboring countries of Syria to see if that's even possible. Those are all real issues that I would have ideas on. But Israel-Palestine, you know, unless there is a fundamental change of leadership on both sides at the same time that brings people to the fore who say, we want to try this one more time, but this time we really mean it, we're serious. I'd say don't make that your priority in the Middle East. I think this attitude that President Trump has, that I want to do this because it's the biggest unsolved problem out there and it'll look cool on my resume. That's not the reason that the United States should be doing it. Unless you can make the case that this is in our national interests in some fundamental way, first, American public won't understand why you're doing it and won't support the cost that it will have in time and effort and political support to do it. And people will quite rightly say, why are you dealing with that issue that doesn't seem to be solvable now and neglecting all these other issues which are really important? And I would say you can't treat Israel-Palestine in a vacuum now. You have to say that the Middle East is facing multiple challenges. There are interesting and complex connections among some of these, and that to begin to get things right in the Middle East, and things have rarely been as messy as they are today, you have to work on several different levels simultaneously. They involve a lot of rethinking of fundamental assumptions, and that would be what I would say to a new administration. You have a chance to rethink your overall approach to the Middle East and perhaps to international relations more generally. And then within that, if there is a moment of opportunity to do something on Israel-Palestine, fine, do what you can. But we're no longer the driving force that we thought we were at one time. We really aren't. I don't think the Israelis are going to listen to us if we say, you know, we really want you to give the West Bank back to the Palestinians. I know the current prime minister will simply say, too bad, we're not going to. And you can't make us. And he's right. And if we say to the Palestinians, you have to give up the right of return because it's unrealistic, full stop. That's all we say to them. Even the weakest Palestinian prime minister, with the least amount of political legitimacy, I don't think he'll say, I'll give it up. Fine, I can stand up to my people and say, you lost that back in 1948, 49, it's over, forget about it. It's just not doable. So there has to be real change of mindsets, first and foremost on the leadership of both sides, and then maybe the Americans can play a helpful role along with others in the international community.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay. Similar but different. I think, of course, it may happen that the United States will decide not to invest efforts and assets in this effort, leave Israelis and Palestinians to their own devices. I hope not, because the United States is, and I think remains, the only international power that can help broker an agreement. Yes, Russia is back in the Middle East. Russia is biting at the U.S. position, trying to position itself as the new broker in Middle Eastern politics. I don't think it can do that. China is still not in the picture. Western Europe definitely is not, and the United States is the only one that can do that. For that, the United States needs to make an initial decision that it comes back fully to the Middle East. The pivot away from the Middle East, which began with Obama, the absence of any comprehensive foreign policy or national security strategy under the present administration. People don't understand what U.S. policy in the Middle East, U.S. policy, foreign policy in general, U.S. foreign policy in particular, in the Middle East is. Who is the Secretary of State? Is he a real policymaker, or is he somebody the president wants to and eventually gets rid of? The National Security Advisor gets rid of. Cabinet ministers make statements, make visits to the region, and then there is a tweet in the middle of the night that runs in the opposite direction. This is no way to run a foreign policy and to win credibility in any part of the world. So I think for the good of the United States and for the good of the international system, this needs to be fixed. When it is fixed, and we have an administration that is ready and willing to resume a role in international politics and in the Middle East, then of course we need the Israeli and Palestinian leadership that would work with them. Second, the Arab-Israeli conflict is pretty much down to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's been telescoped. Syria, I hope, will be put together as a state again in the coming years, but it is not there. So it is not a candidate for a peace negotiation with Israel anytime soon, and what needs to be fixed is the Israeli-Palestinian on its own merits, and as a precondition to enabling Israel to work fully with the Arab states in the Middle East, because it is a condition for the Saudis, the Gulfis, and others, in order to have maybe not a cordial relationship with Israel, but a normal working relationship, that the Palestinian issue needs to be resolved. So it is an important interest. The Middle East remains a crucial part of the world. Just look at the impact of the Syrian civil war on Europe, the immigrants, the terrorists, what it has done to British politics, Brexit, German politics, where Angela Merkel barely made it, and this comes from the Middle East. The Middle East is a very important part of the world and resonates in a way that other parts do not do. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an important part, not the only, but important part of the politics of the region, and the United States, as I indicated, I think remains the only international power that can help broker an agreement.
First of all, I mean, the remarks I'm going to make, I guess in reaction to Bill, I mean, you mentioned Trump's desire to get the ultimate deal, et cetera, et cetera. I must say he is not unique in this. I actually would argue that, for example, at least he's only talking about it. I mean, I would say someone like Kerry actually did damage by doing things wrong. So this is a problem that we face not only with Trump, but with many leaders that we've had, with certainly in the recent past. Now, what I would suggest is maybe three things. Reflect much of what was said before. The first is do no harm. And to me, meaning do no harm, in America we have this ethos. Better to have tried and failed than have never tried before. Failure comes with a price. The more times we fail, the more the legitimacy of diplomacy, the credibility of diplomacy, of peacemaking gets undermined. So before you do anything, take a very hard look at two things, which were mentioned. One, the domestic situation in each of the two countries, Israel and Palestine. Are the leaders, are the people ready? In the Israeli side, I would argue right now, the current leadership is certainly not ready, because I don't believe I can't speak about Prime Minister Netanyahu, I can't get into his head, but certainly his coalition is not one that is capable or willing to make peace. I look at the Palestinians, I see between the division, between the eroding legitimacy of the Abbas, there's not a leader who is capable of making peace. In these kind of situations, if you try, you will fail, do not try. So that's the first I would look to. The second, as Itamar mentioned, I will look at the region. And frankly, look at what the region wants. Ultimately, I think peace can only be made with regional involvement. But you have to, in order to get the region to get involved, you have to give the region what it needs. First of all, reassume leadership. But second, understand that there is a reversal. I remember actually bumping into Condi Rice when she came from one of her first trips to the region, where she was amazed how every Arab leader she was talking to, trying to convince to come along and support the Iraq war, was coming back to her talking about Palestine. Fast forward a few years to a readout of a conversation between Kerry and Sisi, in which Kerry was calling for a peace talk, and Sisi was talking about terrorism, Sinai, Libya, etc. The region wants certain things from the United States. Right now, central to them is Iran. And until we meet these kind of things, don't expect the region to come and get on board. If these things are not ready, if you have not done your homework, don't engage in major diplomacy. However, and this is my last point, we've often approached the peace process, Palestinian-Israeli peace, as an all or nothing. Either we get the whole big deal and we get the signing and the handshake and the Nobel Prize and blah, 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 or we just disengage. I think there's something in between. And I think there's a lot that the US can do to not resolve the conflict that can only happen with negotiations, but to at least put some brakes on the erosion that we continue seeing. There are some virtuous dynamics that we can support, whether it's security cooperation, things of this sort, and there are some vicious dynamics that we can block, whether it is incitement or settlement growth or things of this sort. So if we decide not to go for the big one, let's not give up completely, and there's a lot, I think, that we can do in between until the conditions are more ripe to re-engage.
Thank you. Leila, would you like to have a comment before I open up to questions?
As you say, go regional, but regional is
Go regional?
Iran, Saudi, and Israel. These three actors are engaging in very bad behavior. And we need to maybe think about bilateral strategies as well as regional ones to deal with this, with these three elements. And I don't think you can give up on the Palestinian question to get regional peace and security, because Israel is a key player in the region, and it's a key determinant to why we are where we are. So somehow you have to circle back to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Thank you.
Yep.
We do have time for some audience questions, and I see there are several already. Shall I just call them out, Elizabeth? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Jackson. I'm a sophomore here at American University. I'm a member of the organization Students for Justice in Palestine, and I'm interested in potentially working in Palestine someday to actually assist with the refugee crisis there and in the peace process. This has been a really great discussion so far. I noticed that one of the things that didn't come up was the role of sort of the increasingly popular topic of international human rights in mass media, and I was wondering how the panel thinks that the issue of Israeli apartheid plays in the peace process.
Do you want to address it to any particular panelist or everybody?
There is no Israeli apartheid.
I mean, I agree that there is no Israeli apartheid, but there are certainly human rights violations aplenty among all actors. And though the one thing that I would say here is the following. When you look at this conflict, like many issues, you can't look at it through only one metric. There are many metrics that you have to look at. And I think it's a mistake to approach it thinking it's only a human rights issue, or it's only a high diplomacy issue, or it's only a public opinion issue. I think these are all issues that you have to look at, but at the end of the day, resolving the conflict in the way we see it, look, I mean, we're not talking here about creating future coexistence between the two peoples. For coexistence, you need dealing with some of the past and some of these issues. We are talking about a divorce. We are talking about separation. First, you deal with the separation, and frankly, to do that, you don't need to deal with the human rights issues. Once you deal with the separation, if you want the divorce to be an amicable one, maybe we have to deal with this. But even if it's not amicable, a divorce is better than this bad relationship that we have right now between the two sides.
There was another hand up here. Would you pass the microphone? Oh, you don't have it.
Thank you. My question is kind of related to his, but more specifically, we were talking about the role of civil society and public attitudes. But I think that American support, especially among young people, including young Jewish Americans, is declining. And when they say, like, they support Israel, that's actually decreasing a lot. So if that is a trend that we will continue to see, could that play a role in maybe not direct negotiations, but at least like American leadership and then their role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yeah. Okay. You know, I'm a critic of the current Israeli government on its politics and policies, domestically and externally, including the Palestinian issue, the way the relationship with the United States is conducted. I'm a critic, and I hope the government will be replaced. And people like myself support the two-state solution. The main argument that we use in the intra-Israeli debate is that we need to separate from the Palestinians, and for there to be two states. That this is crucial for Israeli democracy and demography, to Israel's image in the world, and to Israel's relationship with the Jewish diaspora that is declining because of the ongoing occupation. So, you know, at this point, I'm describing to you my personal preferences. By the way, if you conduct an Israeli public opinion poll, at least close to 70% of the Israelis still support the two-state solution. Its support is declining. It has not disappeared. And I would say something else about polls. I say it varies. If you ask people in a poll about a potential peace agreement, so what do you think about an Israeli-Palestinian agreement based on the Clinton parameters and the Barak proposals and the Olmert proposals and so on and so forth, people are dubious. If you confront them with a fait accompli, you make the deal and say, okay, here is the deal, it's a done deal, like Oslo. And people support it because they persuaded them that this is not just a set of concessions, it's a done deal, and it's going to change the reality of your life and the life of the next generation.
There's a hand over here.
Thanks so much. I guess my question is going to be a little bit outside of your tool set, as given that all of you discussed this within the framework of negotiations. So I guess the first question I have is sort of just, as we describe this, right, as you're talking about negotiations, I think you talked a little bit about the power balance and things like that, but one of the things that didn't get addressed by and large was sort of the idea of the U.S. as an honest broker. I mean, you referenced it, but we didn't really talk about it. So I sort of want to understand, and maybe this is more on that side of the table, but in terms of the Palestinians coming back to the table, right, with the Oslo Accords in the 90s, between 1993 and 2000, the number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem doubled, or nearly doubled. By the current data, according to the Israeli government, Shalom Achshav, and the United Nations, that number has nearly tripled. 85% of Israel's wall is built inside the West Bank on Palestinian property and was ruled illegal by the International Court of Justice. And something that was not mentioned at all as we talked about this solution is that Palestinian citizens of Israel, who you may refer to as Arab Israelis, I am one of them, are 22% of the population and don't actually share the same rights as Jewish Israeli citizens. And if you want to look that up, there's over 40 laws, actually over 50 laws that discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel, documented by the Legal Center for Minority Rights in Israel. So given all of these sort of factors, one of the questions I want to raise to you is, you are talking about a negotiation track, as if we are talking about two equal players. But in reality, Israel actually holds dominance over the majority of the Palestinian population, right? Even the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank does not govern everything.
Let's let some of them
so
respond.
can you actually talk a little bit about accountability and the role it plays, because we currently provide military aid to the tune of $4 billion a year to the state of Israel? Thank you.
Thank you. So
Just,
the power asymmetry is the real question.
Well, you started by saying, is the United States an honest broker? And I think it's not, and has never really been. And the Arab parties have known that. They've known that the American commitment to Israel is unlike the commitment that they're likely to have from the United States. So why do they bother dealing with a biased mediator? I think the only answer, and I think it's one that Reith has suggested in his own comments, is that other possible mediators who may be more fair-minded, the Norwegians possibly, or the Swedes or the Chinese or whoever you want to pick, they don't have much ability to influence the Israelis. Now, the Americans, at least in theory, could, both with carrots and with sticks. We tend not to use those carrots and sticks very skillfully, but the only reason, in my view, that Sadat dealt with this, that Assad was willing to deal with this, that Arafat was willing to deal with this, was not because he believed we were an honest broker in the sense of being neutral on the issues. It was because there was the thought that maybe the Americans, for their own reasons, will use their potential leverage with the Israelis to do at least part of what we as Arabs want them to do: withdraw from the occupied territories, recognize some of the Palestinians' rights. I think that perception has eroded. It was there with Nixon and Kissinger, who did produce some results. It was there with Carter. I think it was there with the first president, Bush and Baker. They had credibility as admittedly biased mediators, but producing results. I think it fell apart with Clinton. Clinton wanted to be everybody's best friend. He actually went to Gaza. Nobody remembers this. Got a standing ovation from the Palestine National Council. He spent hours and hours and hours with Arafat. He was never equal in his affections for the Israelis and the Palestinians, but he went pretty far in showing a degree of empathy and openness. And at the end of the day, his efforts failed on both the Syrian track and on the Palestinian track. And I think that was a brutal failure because it meant that George W. Bush wasn't going to touch this issue. He'd seen that Clinton had failed dramatically, and he wasn't going to touch it. And then we had this long, dry period of really, with all due respect to the two of you who were part of it, it wasn't really going. It wasn't going anywhere because of American leadership. If it was going anywhere, it was because some Israelis and some Palestinians, like Itamar, were worried about the process collapsing completely. But we have not seen leadership from the American side for a long time.
I also would like to respond. I'd like to put the shoe on the other foot, as I'm not aware of 50 laws that discriminate against Israeli Arabs. But, oh no, they don't force Arabs to join the military. They don't. No, just a minute. Are you suggesting that the 20% of Israeli citizens who are Palestinians should be subjected to compulsory service in the IDF? I don't think so. No, serious. No, yeah. No. Are you for? No. I think actually it speaks to the credit. No, I think it speaks to the credit of Israel that does not force its Arab citizens to serve in the military. But you may have a different view. But in any event, they certainly have the right to vote, right? And so they have a right to vote, okay? So what my complaint is, why don't they vote for the people who support two-state solution? Mr. Herzog lost the last election to Mr. Netanyahu by a small margin. If 50% or 30% of the Israeli Arabs, instead of voting for Arab parties, would have voted for Mr. Herzog, we would have had a different Israeli government now that supports the two-state solution. Why don't they do it?
Well, why doesn't any Israeli leader agree to form a coalition with the Arab parties?
Another good question.
If I may, just two quick. To add to what Bill said initially, in addition to the fact that we always believe the U.S. can deliver, there was another aspect to it as well. No one else wanted to do it. Europeans, you talk to them and they always complain that Americans are not doing it right, blah, 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 blah. The Americans get out of the scene. Where are you? Europeans don't come in. And when they do it very ineffectively. Don't believe me, look at the Paris conference a year and a half ago. There are certain things that prevent others from coming in, and so ultimately, in many ways, the international system is built so that the U.S. is the one. On the Palestinian citizens of Israel, while I disagree with you, Itamar, there are many structural discrimination aspects of it. However, if you are thinking of a two-state solution concept, as a Palestinian, I don't speak, or as a Palestinian negotiator, I did not speak for the Palestinian people as such. I cannot speak for the citizens of Israel. These are citizens of Israel, and their fight is not a fight of liberation. Because at the end of the day, if you speak for the PLO, you're asking for your own independent state, you're asking for self-determination. These are citizens of Israel who have a civil rights issue that they have to approach through a civil rights approach.
Go ahead, Leila.
I think this is very interesting. There's clearly a generational shift happening. And it's very apparent here. And I think that people are not buying the two-state solution anymore because, it didn't work, it's not happening, and there's a lot of suffering. And I think that we can sit here and talk about diplomacy and U.S. policy, but on the ground, public opinion is shifting in favor of the Palestinians because, and so, it's very interesting.
Sound of one man clapping.
And so,
Better than none.
and so we will need I think Obama, I understand how Obama disengaged in the U.S. The Middle East does not deserve more attention than any other region in the world, but yet it gets a disproportionate amount of money and attention. And so his position, I did not fault him for it, but the result has been really disastrous. And so I do think we need good leadership, and we do need to figure out how to solve a conflict where the prominent paradigm of two states it's always been a falsehood, it's always been a theory, and it hasn't worked, it hasn't delivered, it hasn't convinced anyone, and we're very far away from it. And I think the new generation is showing us that if the U.S. is to provide leadership, it's going to have to contend with shifting politics. It's going to have to come up with a new paradigm. It's going to have to provide leadership in new and innovative ways.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before we acknowledge and thank our panelists. This gentleman in the back with the white shirt.
Hello? Okay. So my name is Anis. I'm a graduate student here at American University. I think there is a tendency in this, discussion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to focus on the past, and the hurt that people have been caused. I grew up in Israel as well, so I've experienced a little bit of that. But I would like to take this opportunity to ask you guys, and that you give us some of your experience and your insight into the future. Itamar, for you specifically, with the geostrategic changes in the Middle East, what do you think is the Israeli interest right now in making peace and really getting to a comprehensive solution? And Mr. Al-Omari, if you could provide us with a little bit of insight regarding the Palestinian leadership, especially now when we know that the changing of the guard is coming. And for you, Mr. Quant, if you don't mind, my last question would be, what are some of those steps that the United States and all of the other actors, if you have input in that, what are those interim solutions that we can get to, or some of the areas where we can have compromise? And hopefully, with the Passover holiday, the holiday of freedom coming up, we'll have a little bit more of that in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Panelists? I think it was to you first, Gaith, and then to Bill second.
It was to Itamar first, but I'll take the first stab at it. The future of Palestinian leadership, jokingly I would say, read my 70-page piece on it. The executive summary is the following. Abbas has done everything he can to ensure that no one emerges as a viable alternative. Why? Why did he do that? Because this is basically the first chapter in the dictator's handbook. If you have a potential successor, that person might become impatient. The problem with this is the following. The Palestinian political system right now is so weak. The failure of the political system to deliver what it promised, liberation through diplomacy, add to it the poor governance, corruption, closing of political space, human rights violations. When you have such a weak political system and such unclear succession, there's a high possibility that things might go very bad. The idea of collapse is out there. Institutional collapse, not only of the PA, but also of the structures, Fatah, PLO, the legitimacies that put the Palestinian system together. To me, that's a disaster. It's a disaster because, from my perspective, the two-state solution is the only solution that gives the Palestinians what they need, which is self-determination. It's not only about rights, it's about the right of a people to have a state of their own, to define the future of their own, and that can only happen through a two-state solution, and that can only happen through legitimate Palestinian structures. So you ask about succession. I fear that the dysfunction right now might rob us, the Palestinian people, of what we deserve, which is our own future.
I just want to say just one thing. I'm not saying that two states isn't the solution, but what does it look like? I think the assumptions of what it looked like before no longer hold true. And so it could be two states, it could be one state, it could be no state. I don't know, but someone has to give it.
You sound like Trump, you know.
Did he say that? Yes. I don't follow it.
No comparison between our panelists and the
Yeah.
president.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah. No, but this is literally what he said.
But that's not what I.
No, that's not what you meant, I know. Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to say something. So, two-state solution is receding, is becoming less popular among Palestinians, among Israelis now, but there is no alternative. What's the alternative? One state? Throw, let's say, almost basically equal number of Jews and Palestinians into one pot and say, now start getting along after all these years. I don't think it's going to work. There may be a civil war, ending with a two-state solution after a civil war. So let's skip the civil war and let's, second, I don't think the solution is available right now for all the reasons have been mentioned, but I think it's mandatory upon us to make sure that what is called the status quo does not continue, because there is no status quo. Status quo means drifting annexation, which I think is bad for everybody, including for Israel. And therefore, as I think Raith has already alluded, there are so many other steps that we can take in the middle. Pass on parts of Area C to the Palestinian Authority, organize a major humanitarian effort for Gaza, and give you 8 or 10 steps that can be taken now that would significantly ameliorate the situation until such time arrives where you can successfully negotiate a two-state solution. Now, this is, from an Israeli perspective, mandatory for Israel to separate from the Palestinians, to stop the occupation. And secondly, looking at the region and at our international position, we need a peaceful solution in order to build better relationship with our environment and to keep the deterioration of our international position because of the ongoing occupation.
Well, I'm not sure I have much to add. There is the do no harm thing. Trump just did some harm with the inexplicable decision to give away a symbolic card that we had said previously that Jerusalem its status should be resolved through negotiations between the parties. We just threw that out now and said we Americans, who have no right to decide anything for the Palestinians or the Israelis, have unilaterally decided the fate of Jerusalem. Not that it will necessarily stick if the people don't want it, but that's the kind of thing that I don't want to see, is this kind of arrogant American saying, you should do this, and if you don't, you're going to pay a high price in terms of your relationship with us. There are a few old standby themes that I think we should not throw out entirely. We shouldn't be afraid to talk about what's going on in the West Bank and, quite frankly, in Gaza as well, as an occupation. Not a physical occupation in Gaza, but the way in which things are managed. It's a very non-free place. And the West Bank is fundamentally under occupation. That's a word that people don't like to use. Some people don't. Our ambassador in Israel will not use that word. But that's trying to make a very bad situation look nicer. And I don't think we do any help to anybody, Israelis or Palestinians, by trying to whitewash a very bad situation. And I think one theme that American leaders should say is that this is not a healthy situation. The occupation should end. It should end through an agreement between Palestinians, Israelis, on whatever they can agree on. And if in the interim there are steps that can be taken, stopping settlements, humanitarian actions, whatever, security cooperation, fine. We'll help the parties as much as we can to do it. But in terms of big, bold, new ideas to take the place of the old ones, I would say that the few new ideas that I've heard recently, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, was counterproductive. Not using the word occupation, trying to whitewash, this is just a way for Israelis and Palestinians to learn to live together. That can only be said by somebody who has not been in the West Bank and seen the reality of what happens between Palestinians and settlers. It's just not a crucible for peace and understanding, on the contrary. So, it's a limited list if and when we get to the point when there's an Israeli leader who wants to take serious steps to end the conflict, and there's a Palestinian leader who is able to produce a consensus among his population that the best offer that an Israeli can make is minimally acceptable to them, we should throw a lot of weight behind it. But we're no longer credible as the party who can shape the details of that. It's going to have to come much more from the dynamic between sensible Israelis and sensible Palestinians. And that may mean new definitions of sovereignty, new definitions of zones that aren't exclusively Israeli or exclusively Palestinian. The idea that we can treat the West Bank the way we treated Sinai, just draw a line around it and say, that's Israel and that's Palestine or that's Egypt, that kind of border is gone. It's gone because the Israelis didn't want that kind of border. They could have had it with King Hussein. If they had agreed at some point to withdraw to the 1967 lines, and from East Jerusalem, King Hussein would have gone back into the West Bank, even though Palestinians would have been unhappy with that, and he would have been willing to do it. But the Israelis wanted East Jerusalem, and they wanted parts of the West Bank. Now, to his credit, Rabin did not want very much of the West Bank. When he came to see President Carter, he said, what I want in the West Bank is security. And that does not mean we need sovereignty there. And I remember, as the note taker to that conversation, thinking, if that is really the Israeli view, there's a deal to be had, whether it's with Jordan or with the Palestinians. That is no longer the position of the Israeli government. And for that reason, we're going to have new paradigms that accept, perhaps, that some of the settlers will indeed stay beyond what is the officially recognized border of Israel. How do you do that in a way that creates a secure environment for everybody involved? I don't know. But unless somebody can open their minds and think those issues through, we're not going to get anywhere close.